Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is chapter 5 of Demai, Halacha 2. This is part 2 of the shiur. We ended off yesterday actually with a Maloket Tanayim, where there was a disagreement about what happens if a Yisrael goes and separates out Truma Meiser. Now, this Yerushalmi here comes along and says, well, he can't separate out Trumas Meiser from something that's not his. It's not his property. It doesn't belong to him. Now, there's a Maloket that comes up in Trumos 1:1, where actually Rabbi Yosef is going to say he's not allowed to do it. It's not his property. But if it's done, it's done. But if you're having the intention to go do it, it's a problem. But if somebody went and did it, they did it. It's valid. So they're all right. All these answers are right. The minority opinion that shows up in the Mishnah elsewhere, that's not going to be. So over there, it's going to be in Bavli Gittin 30b, and Abba Elazar Ben Gamla over there is going to say that he's actually going to be allowed to separate out Trumas Meiser and do it without a problem. Rabbi Yosef in Trumos 1:1 says, look, the only way it works is if it's done after the fact, but you're not allowed to go do it. And if it's already done, it's done. This shiur is going to get into really, first of all, how the Chazan Ish resolves doing all of the separations. And the formula of the Chazan Ish is actually going to be very, very simple. This one is going to be a little bit more complicated here in the Gemara that the Mishnah talks about. And again, one of the things that comes up again and again and again in the Shas is that there's really always going to be two systems of mathematics going on. One is going to be very, very simple for people who aren't as learned or intelligent to easily grasp with an estimate. And then there's going to be one that's going to be more precise. And that's always going to be in everything, whether it's going to be for separation here or it's going to be calculation of astronomy things in the Gemara or other mathematics and geometry. It's always going to be how it is. So over here we're going to see a case like that. And we're also going to get into really getting into the fibers of the body, of the soul and the body and the mind, really how the separations work, like Truma Gedola. Keep in mind, Truma Gedola is always by estimate. And that's how all of these calculations can work, because, again, if you're a little bit off, the Truma Gedola is always going to be an estimate. And it's designed that way on purpose. When you go up and you watch in an orchard in the north in Eretz Yisrael, and you watch them do separation at Truma Meiser, they'll have a very big bin. And there's people running around, they're trying to load things and harvest things, and they're trying to get everything ready. And if you had it where it was going to be like the later tithes, where things are broken down into smaller quantities and packaged and ready to sell, it would be impossible to run an operation. And, it's going to be by estimate, and it has to be by estimate because they can't have scales and try to calculate these quantities. These quantities are huge. So this is going to be done by an eyeball estimate on the Truma Meiser, and it's designed that way on purpose. Now, the Gemara is going to get into why the Mishnah is going to instruct the owner to separate Truma Meiser in this roundabout way. And that's really what the Mishnah is talking about. And first, he's going to state that 1/100th is going to remain Hulin. And then, after he declares the remainder of the marked off portion to be Truma, he's going to return to declare the original 100th to be Meiser, and then Trumas Meiser. So that's what we're going to be getting into. And, keep in mind that the Truma Gedola, that's going to be called Reshit. That's how the Torah itself refers to it. You can find this in Devarim 18:4. So that's one of the key ideas that's going to be coming up. So if he would immediately declare the 100th to be Meiser, and afterward he would designate the rest as Truma Gedola, then you have a problem because he would have been found to come and advance the separation, says this Gemara, of Meiser ahead of the separation of Truma, and that's not allowed. So you see that the Truma is called Rashit, and that there's an order to it. The Truma Gedola is called Rashit. And there's another pasuk that talks about how the tithes dafka has to be done in order. And it's a sin to do it out of order. So if he was going to first designate the Truma Gedola, says the Gemara, and afterward designate the rest of the Meiser, he would be found to either subtracting from the amount required for his Meisros or adding an amount required for his Meisros. Now this is a really deep idea. This comes up in Trumos 1:7. And again, Trumos is going to be done by estimate. And it's not going to be done by precise measure. Now, if you're going to take everything out of order, then you have a problem because on the second set of tithes, because the first one is done by estimate, you either over-measured it or you under-measured it. The second set of tithes and the third set of tithes and the fourth set of tithes and even the fifth set of tithes, if you're going to do challah, these are all going to be exact. These are going to be, calculated. And if you advanced it ahead of Truma Gedola, what this Gemara is trying to teach us is that you ended up, in a way, stealing from the tribe of the Kohanim because you either underdid how much it was supposed to be going to the tribe of the Kohanim, or you overdid the amount that's going to the Levim, which also underdoes for the Kohanim, and that's also not right. And you end up having a problem because now you have a flawed way to tithe, and you have a way that's going to end up where you're messing up the tithe in a way where, and again, if you're going to look at like the precise way to calculate this, you're going to see that you've overdone it, and it's you've ruined it. So the Gemara is going to say, like it was taught in the Brisa, one who designates less than 1/10 of his maestros are rectified, but his remaining produce is ruined. And that's really, again, you have a theft issue in here, but Rabbi Kanievsky explains that, as an example, if you take 100 sa'ah of produce, he needs to separate out 10 as Meiser Rishon, in which case the remaining 90 is going to be permitted as chulin, and the separated 10 as Meiser Rishon. Now, Rabbi Kanievsky explains if he separates only 9 sa'ah as Meiser Rishon, those 9 that get rectified, only 90 sa'ah. So then you have 81 as chulin and 9 as Meiser Rishon. Now, I want to go back to the first example. If you did it where you had 100, right? You'll have 10 as Meiser Rishon, and then you have 90 as permitted chulin, and then you separate 10 out as Meiser Rishon. But if he's separating out only 9 as Meiser Rishon, and he's underdoing the tithe, okay, then you can see here, only 90 seah, there's only 9 that's rectified. And so you have 89 that's really chulin. And so you have 10 seah left over that remains tevel. In other words, part of the problem when you're underdoing the tithes or you're mixing up the order, and what they really want you to get in a visceral way, and if you sit down with a pen and paper and you go over the mathematics, what you're going to see is not only is there a theft from either the tribe of the Levim or the tribe of the Kohanim, but you're left with extra tevel. And that's what Rabbi Kanievsky's point is. If you're underdoing the part that's supposed to be measured, and instead of doing 10 parts, you're doing 9 parts, you're left over where you have 10 parts off that's going to be chulin. Tevel. And so the 9 sa'ah that he separates as Meiser are going to be permitted as Meiser Rishon. That, by the way, this is what he, rectified and tithe. But the remaining sa'ah is going to be a mixture of Tevel. And it can't be eaten. And that's the point. That's what it means that his produce is ruined, according to Rabbi Kanievsky. In other words, when you go and you mis-tithe it, and you overdo the tithes, or you underdo the tithes after Truma Gedola, and again, those tithes that come after Truma Gedola have to be precise. Well, the problem is when you overdo it, or you're going to do it by estimate, or you're going to underdo it, is you're now going to be left with a mixture that has Tevel inside of it. And you can't eat that. And then you have, a theme that comes up a lot of times in the Shas is a lot of times when somebody's doing an Avera, a lot of times there'll be a few Averas in there. They count out when somebody eats an ant. And they count how many Averas somebody made when somebody eats a whole ant. Or how many Averas somebody eats when they eat a whole bee. And there's a lot. I believe it's 5 and 6. Now, over here, you didn't just steal, but you now have, you did it out of order, which is also forbidden. And you also stole from either the tribe of the Levim or the tribe of the Kohanim. And you also are supposed to tithe it properly. That's also one of the mitzvot. And you didn't. So you also didn't do that mitzvah. So in fact, you're messing up on a lot of mitzvot, and it's a problem. So that's the deep concept, is that when you're doing it out of order, you end up ruining the mixture, and part of it is going to oftentimes have Tevel inside of it, plus all the elements of theft. The Gemara continues, says, one who exceeds 1/10 for his maestros is ruined while his remaining produce is rectified. So now let's talk about a case in the opposite way, where he's going to over-tithe it. He's going to do it out of order, and he's going to over-tithe the 1/10 of his maestros. And it's saying that's also ruined, and here's why. Let's take an example. Again, this is going to be from Rabbi Kanievsky. You have 100 sa'ah of produce, okay? And he separates out 11 as meiser. Now you have 89 that are rectified as hulin. Now, of that 11, that he separated, only 9 and 8/9, it's a fraction, 8/9, are Meiser Rishon. Now, Meiser is always 1/9 of the rectified hulin. For example, if he has 100 sa'ah and he takes 10 off the Meiser, 10 and 1/9 are of the rectified 90. Then he has 90 that's rectified. Okay, so it's always going to be 1/9. All right. So if he has 100 and he takes off 10, 1/9 is going to be rectified, and that means that he has 90 that's been fixed. It's rectified. Okay, and that's what you want. But if you have a case where only 89 are rectified, the Meiser then has a problem where the other 1 and 1/9 are not Meiser, since there's no Tevel for them to rectify. And it's also not Hulin, since there's nothing done to rectify it. So if you're taking out 11 sa'ah of Meiser, you actually have a mixture of Meiser and Tevel, and that can't be eaten. So when you're over, it's a question of where is the Tevel going to be. If you're underdoing it, the main pile is going to have a mixture of Tevel in it. When you're overdoing the Meiser, your Meiser pile now has a mixture of Tevel inside of it, and you can't do anything with it. It's a mess. There's no way for you to fix it. It's a big problem. So the Mishnah is instructing the person to first say that of the estimated 300s that he marked off, and again, it's an estimated because the Truma Meiser is always by estimate, and it has to be by estimate. It's the only one that's done by estimate. The rest are done by precision. So then it talks about an exact 100th will remain as unsanctified hulin, and that's going to be from the remaining pile. So he takes out 3% as estimate. That, by the way, is going to be a little bit more than what you need for Truma Meiser. There's not a problem with that. With the Truma Gadol, I mean. There's not a problem with that, because again, it's by estimate. If you overestimate it a little bit, it's okay. And then the rest of what's remaining now, he's saying that the hundredth, an exact hundredth, is going to remain unsanctified as chulin. And then he's going to declare the remainder, which is going to be approximately 2/100ths of the whole, to be Truma Gedola. And then he's going to return to designate the remaining exact hundredth as Truma Meiser. Now, in this way, the person fulfills all the requirements of tithing. He's, one, done the Truma by estimate, which you're supposed to do. And he designates Truma Meiser precisely, which he's also supposed to do. And he's going to designate the Truma before the Trumas Meiser, which is also what he's supposed to do. Now, there's a simpler way to do all three of these and to get all three of these requirements. The Chazan Ish has a formula in his Demai in 12.2, and that's going to avoid the need to begin reserving the 100th as chulin. And so the way the Chazan Ish is going to work it is, after they mark off roughly 3/100ths of the entire pile, one is going to say as follows. He's going to say the part of the marked off portion that is in excess of the 100th of everything is hereby made into Truma Gedola on this side. And again, that's an approximation. And we're allowed to do an approximation of the Truma Gedola. And at that point, approximately 2/100ths are going to be designated as Truma, which is precisely 1/100th is left as Tevel. And that then becomes, that later will become Truma Meiser. And the remaining 100th, along with 9 other equally sized parts next to it, in the unmarked off portion, are going to be made into Meiser. That's what he's going to declare. And the 100th that I originally made Meiser Rishon is hereby made into Truma Meiser. Now, for whatever reason, the formula that the Mishnahs used is a more complicated formula, and that's not generally used today. The way that's done today is the Chazan Ish's basic formula, which is commonly used today. And that's going to be only today in a day where Truma is not going to be eaten by the Kohen, because the Kohen is going to be Temeh. Now, it's going to be unnecessary to separate 2% for Truma, and instead a tiny amount of Truma is going to suffice, just as it does according to biblical law. And that's going to be the formula of the Chazan Ish. So rather than mark off approximately 3/100ths of the pile before rectifying the formula or reciting the formula as taught by the Mishnah, nowadays one is going to separate out a bit more than 100th. And in the view of the Gemara coming up, there's going to be a new motive for the person who wishes to separate out Truma and Truma Meiser simultaneously. And so far it's been assumed that the advantage of combining these two separations is that it saves the person the bother of making two individual separations. That, by the way, is the preferred way to do it, is to do two separations. And in fact, if you're Yisrael, that's really the best way to do it. Now, it's going to become apparent in the Gemara coming up that if a person separates out Truma and Truma Meiser into two separate tithes, and then he's going to separate out the Truma, which he does by estimate, Truma Gedol is by estimate, he needs to measure 1/10 for the Meiser Rishon. That, by the way, has to be an exact measure. It's going to be 1/10, all right? Now, you have 1/10 of that, by the way, 1/10 of that 10th is going to be Truma Meiser. Now, this precise measuring can be hard, but one of the advantages of this system is by combining the separations of Truma and Truma Meiser, the need to measure the Truma Meiser becomes minimized. And the person can simply state that 1/100th shall remain unsanctified, and then returns after declaring the remainder to be Truma. And he's going to declare the first hundredth Truma Meiser without measuring anything. And he did it exactly. It's 100% correct. And there's an advantage to doing it like that. So there's a Beraisa that's going to teach the amount that one separated out as Meiser is not exactly 1/10. Either his Meiser or his produce is going to be ruined. And this teaching is going to get qualified in another Beraisa. Again, there's two ideas. If you're going to overdo the miser separation, and it's not going to exactly be a 10, all right, then the problem is either if you're going to underdo the amount that you're separating out as miser, there's a part of Tevel inside of the main pile. That's a problem. You can't eat Tevel. It's a mixture. And if you're going to separate out your miser and you're going to overtake your miser, you're not going to be precise, you're going to overtake it, inside of the pile is miser, but there's also a part that is extra, and that extra is Tevel, and that's a problem. So Rabbi Yossi is going to explain about this. He's going to say that he relies on a stipulation of the court. And what is a stipulation of the court? It says how much can a person's tithing be off of the 1/10 mark, and the court stipulation still apply. Now, the Vilna Goan is saying that the Bet Din stipulates that if somebody mistakenly separated more or less than a tenth, the miser, in fact, takes effect in the correct amount. For example, if you have 100 sa'ah of produce separated, and somebody's taking out 11 sa'ah, and that's going to be 11 as miser instead of the 10. So according to what this court ruling is saying, where they're saying that the miser is ruined, in other words, forbidden for consumption, since 11 are going to be a mixture, then really what's going to be is 8/9 of the sa'ah is going to be miser, that's going to be correct, and 1/9 is going to be tevel. So Rabbi Yossi is going to be stating here that a court is going to adjust the person's error so that in fact 9 sa'ah of the separated amount become miser, and the separated amount is going to be rectified. So what the court is going to do is it's going to make a slight adjustment on the 9th portion, and so that they can make round numbers. And Rabbi Yossi is stating that the stipulation of this Bet Din is going to adjust the person's error and make 1 sa'ah of the remaining part to be a round number. And then the remaining produce will be rectified rather than a mixture of hulin and tevel. And the other part is still going to be at issue. So the Chazan Ish is going to be explaining about this, that, how does the court have the power to declare someone else's produce to be miser? This, by the way, is in Demai 15:6. And the Chazan Ish explains that since all the Jews knew that the rabbis enacted enactments for their benefit, whenever Jews separate miser, they do so subject to the will of the rabbis. In other words, also like whoever betroths a woman does so at the will of the rabbis. It is as if a person who separates maestros says, let maestros take effect the way the sages say it should. So, in other words, the court says, look, we're going to round it up. So, yeah, technically speaking, if you have 11 sa'ah and you're supposed to be taking out 10 sa'ah, all right, then what's going to happen is it's going to be 9 8/9 sa'ah of miser, and 1 1/9 sa'ah of tevel. And what the court basically ruled is they said, let it be rounded up so that you'll have 10 sa'ah of miser and you'll have 1 sa'ah of tevel in there. And then you'll have it where that 1/9 gets adjusted. And again, it's not that big a deal. And sometimes on the other side, it's going to benefit the tribe of the Levi, and sometimes on the other side, where there's an overestimation or an underestimation, it can benefit the person who's tithing it a little bit, or it can benefit the Levim, and basically it'll even out. So that's really what this court ruling is. Again, on one case, sure, they might be taking away from the Levi, but on another case where it's going to be underestimated, they might be giving to the tribe of the Levi. So, sometimes it's going to benefit the Yisrael, and sometimes it's not. So the Gemara is going to say, what is the stipulation of the court? In other words, how much can the person's tithing be off this 1/10 mark, and the court stipulation still apply? And the Gemara says, until the amount that the mind can reasonably err. In other words, if somebody should fall short or exceed the amount of tithes in an amount that the person who is actually attempting to tithe it properly might reasonably make an error, the miser is not going to be ruined. And in this case, the court's going to stipulate that the called for amount of miser would take effect. But if the person's stipulation is really grossly off the mark, the court stipulation does not cover him, and actually the miser is really going to be ruined. Now, the Vilna Goan is going to explain that since Rabbi Yossi agrees that the tithing must attempt to separate out the trumas miser, the maestros precisely, Rabbi Yossi, says the Vilna Goan, is agreeing that the Mishnah's procedure should in fact be used. And Rabbi Yossi's intent is that in some cases where it's not possible to be precise, the court's stipulation should adjust this separation so that the tithes would take effect in the correct amount. Now, again, Rabbi Yossi's point is deep. Rabbi Yossi is pointing out that, yes, there is this court ruling to help even things up. But really, Rabbi Yossi is saying, but do it the way the Mishnah recommends. Okay, this is really the way you should tithe it, and then you don't have any problems with 1/9 and overdoing it, where instead of doing, where you're supposed to be separating out 10 units out of 100, you're separating out 11 units out of 100 or 9 units out of 100. Both, as you can see, are problematic. If you do either 9 or 11, you really need 10. And the way that you're going to get this precise amount is you follow the way of the Mishnah. Now, the issue, again, is going to be coming up. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but this way of separating that the Mishnah calls for, it's for a Levi or a Kohen because they already own the produce. And again, it goes back to this Maloket Tanayim. So the Gemara is going to continue, and Rabbi Yochanan's going to say that where a person separates too little miser, which is the case that the court stipulation designates the supplementary amount of miser within the remaining pile. The stipulation is, says the Gemara, formulated so that the person assigns the additional amount of miser rishon in being the pile's northern side, and the additional amount of miser sheni is going to be in the pile's southern side, and the additional amount of trumas miser is going to be in the northernmost pile's northern side. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, what is another clause of the court stipulation? That when the Meiser Sheni is redeemed, the extra Meiser Sheni in the part added by the court stipulation should also be redeemed. So Rabbi Yochanan is going to basically be saying that, according to Rabbi Kanievsky, the law is that one who designates Trumas Meiser for his pile, the produce must be a thing where you're going to specify a place, and you have to specify a place within a pile. That, by the way, is always going to be the case. You're always going to specify where these gifts are located. And you can see this over in the Mishnah in Trumos 3:5. It's just the way it is. So in this case where the person's going to take off too little Meiser Rishon, and the court's going to stipulate that an additional amount should be Meiser Rishon within the pile, how does this stipulation comply with the rule that the court specifies the extra Meiser Rishon should be located in the northern part of the northern section? So if the person separated too little Meiser Sheni, the court is specifying that the extra Meiser Sheni should be located in the southern part of the pile. Now, Rabbi Kanievsky is going to say it like this. He's going to say the question arises. Since the person separated too little Meiser only inadvertently, he's going to be oblivious to the fact that the Bet Din has stepped in to fix his error. And that being the case, the stipulation will not create a stumbling block. And the remaining produce now is going to contain a small amount of Trumas Meiser and Meiser Sheni, yet the person's unaware of the fact, and he's going to eat the produce that's in it as chulin. So there's a problem in there, because now you might have a part where part of it might be chulin. So we learned, says Rabbi Kanievsky, we learned that in a case where the person separated too little Meiser Sheni, the court is going to stipulate an additional amount of Meiser Sheni corresponding to the missing amount is going to take effect within the remaining pile of the produce. So what the court's trying to do is trying to make these small adjustments so that you're not eating Tevel or you're not eating a ruined pile. So Rabbi Kanievsky explains that when the person comes to redeem his Meiser Sheni, his intent presumably is to redeem only the Meiser Sheni of the separated portion. So the question is, how is the Meiser Sheni within the remaining part, where you're going to have a part that's added by this court stipulation, redeemed? And the answer, says Rabbi Kanievsky, is that another clause of stipulation says that the redemption applies to all Meiser Sheni, including the extra part located within the pile of the produce. So the court is really trying to go through that you have a person who really is trying to measure the things correctly, and he makes a small mistake. He doesn't follow the Mishnah, and he's trying to do it, and he overdoes the Meiser Sheni, or the Meiser Rishon, or he underdoes it unintentionally. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to go through the rest of the pile with the court stipulation to make these adjustments so that you're okay. And how can you be doing that? Well, right now, this pile is Demai. And we're talking about something that it could be Tevel, right? It could be Tevel, in which case you really should follow the Mishnah's formulation, and then you won't have any problem. But the Mishnah's procedure is going to be okay in the case of Tevel. But if you're dealing with where you're doing everything in order and then you're messing up, okay? Maybe you're a Yisrael and maybe you can't follow the exact procedure in the Mishnah because you don't own the product. Well, if you're doing this and it's a case of Demai, well, the court stipulation is going to be okay because anyway it's D'Rabbanan. The question is going to come up, well, what about in a case where you're trying to do this and now you're trying to do everything in order, you're Yisrael, and you messed up and you overdid it or you underdid it, and it's a day where this is going to be actual Tevel. Well, you're going to have an issue. Either you're going to have to check if the ruling from the court is going to apply post Demai. In other words, this is going to be fine for Demai and separating out in a case of Demai. I'm not sure it's going to work for a case where this is going to be derived to Tevel, and then you ended up ruining the mixture. Now, we'll find out about that because Eliyahu Hanavi will come and let us know. But right now, we're talking about the Demai, and it's going to be okay for this. Now, the Gemara is going to say another thing. The Gemara is going to now talk about this court stipulation that specifies the location of various tithes. And again, tithes have to be designated in a location. So the Gemara says that this is understandable in regard to a dry item like grain or fruit, but regarding liquid like wine or oil, how do you move around the contents of the container to get a specific place of the liquid? And the Gemara doesn't answer that. And I have a guess why the Gemara doesn't answer that. Because there's a Mishnah coming up later in chapter 7, Halacha 2 of Masechet Demai that resolves how to take tithes out of a cup of liquid, whether it's going to be the top or the bottom, and how to do it. So why does it need to go answer it when it's already in the Mishnah? It's already explained. And that's why the Gemara doesn't give an explanation, because it's obvious. Go look at the Mishnah in 7.2. The Gemara now is going to talk more about this court stipulation. It's going to say that if someone had 100 figs, 50 large and 50 small, and he's going to take from the large ones, he needs only 9. And if he takes from the small ones, he needs to take 11. So, for example, says Rosh Cirilio, when you look at the total weight of the figs, and it's going to be 10 litra, okay? He needs to remove 1 litra as Meiser Rishon. So if 9 large figs or 11 small figs are going to come up to be a litra, then the number of large or small figs he's going to need to remove is going to be, sized accordingly. Okay, so Another way to look at this is don't necessarily look at the number of units, look at the total weight. And that's why they're talking later in Meiser's, Gemara and Maestros and in Trumos about weighing things. So that's going to also be a case that's coming up here. If you're going to have like some large produce or smaller produce, you go by the weight, and then you can start to figure out how to separate it. So the Gemara says if he needs to take from the small ones, he's going to take 11. And if he makes some mistakes and takes 10 of the large ones, he would have added to his tithes, and the court stipulation will go into effect. And in that case there's going to be one hulin fig among the Meiser Rishon figs. And since it's not possible to know which is the hulin fig, we should be concerned to say, says this Gemara, that perhaps the hulin fig is the one he then took out as Trumas Meiser. So let's say he's separating out Maestros and he overdoes the tithe. You don't know which one is going to be the untithed fig because you messed up. One is going to be hulin. So maybe you didn't separate out the tithes from the Trumas Meiser from the Meiser Rishon fig. Maybe you took out the Truma Meiser from the hulin fig that was untithed. So now you have a problem. So the Gemara is going to be saying, and since it's not possible to know which is the hulin fig, we're worried that perhaps the hulin fig is the one that he takes out as Trumas Meiser. And the Gemara says, as it is written, you shall rise up from it, a truma of heaven, a tithe from a tithe. And that implies that you have to take it not from hulin, but from a tithe. So the question is going to be that if you were supposed to take out 9 large ones, instead you took out 10 large ones. You don't know which of this extra fig or date is going to be the hulin one. Okay, you underdid it, or you overdid it. And you were supposed to take out 9, and instead you took out 10. And the question is, this extra one that you're taking out might have been the hulin, and you can't take out the Trumas Meiser from something that's not sanctified. It has to come from something sanctified. We have a Deraita verse from that. The question is this court stipulation going to also deal with this kind of case where it would be ruined or not ruined? Gemara is going to answer. Rabbi Bun Bar Chana says that he stipulates and says the Meiser to which these 100 fruits are subject is hereby fixed in these 10 figs at the beginning of each and every stem, and at the part surrounding the fig stem, and extends toward the other end of the fig until there's reached for all 10 figs collectively the amount of Meiser. So the court's giving a stipulation how to do it, and basically what they're saying, the fig itself doesn't totally become Meiser. Rather, the Meiser is going to be designated next to the stem of each fig, and it's to extend through the adjacent 90% of the fig, with the last 10% in each fig. And that's going to be part of the stem, and that part is going to remain as hulin. So in other words, what the court is stipulating is that you should take the dates or the figs or the remaining produce, and you should organize it so that since you overdid it, the part of it remains, you would say, like, okay, 9/10 of it is going to be, the true tithe, and the 1/10 is going to be left over as hulin. And then from there, you'll be able to fish it out. So the Gemara is going to ask a question. And the Gemara is going to ask, it says, so far you've solved the problem for a case of large figs. So again, in the case of solving it for a large fig, you were supposed to take out 9 large figs. Instead, you took out 10. What the court stipulation is saying, look, don't go by the number of figs. Take the total amount and the weight, and say that this 9/10 of it, of this fig area, is going to be the proper tithe, and then this 1/10 of the fig area, so it's going to be from the stem of the fig down 10%, is going to be the hulin part, and then you separate that out. You cut it off, and that's going to be good. But the Gemara is going to ask, but what happens if there's a small number and you underdid it? So the Gemara is going to say, if, for example, there was a small number, and, for example, the person had just 10 figs, and 5 large and 5 small, and he would take from the large ones, and he would need to take 1 fig minus a bit. So again, it's recommending that you take it off in bits. And if he would take off from the small ones, he would need to take off 1 fig plus a bit. That's what the Gemara says. Gemara continues, says, but if he would make a mistake and take off the whole fig of the big ones, there would be a small amount of hulin within the fig. In other words, let's say you have 5 big figs and 5 small figs. And let's say you're designating out from 5 large and 5 small, and you're taking out the large ones. And the problem is, you're taking out some of the large ones for the behalf of the small ones. You're going to end up with a case where part of this mixture is now going to be hulin. Part of it's going to be tithe, and part of it's not. Because again, you're really supposed to be doing this by weight. Instead, this guy's calculating it out by the number of figs. And what's going to happen is a little part of the fig that's going to be left over is going to be a hulin. And what the Bet Din is trying to get you to do is go back to not separate it out by the number of figs, but do it by weight. That's really what they're trying to do to get you to go back to fix this. So in this case where you're worried about this small amount of hulin in a fig, the Gemara is going to say that we should be concerned to say that perhaps the hulin portion of the fig is the part that he's going to go make truma meiser. Now, the Levi who's going to get the fig as truma meiser, he's going to separate out the hulin part as his truma meiser. But there's also a concern that's raised for these figs, because part of it might not be completely hulin, and you'll have only a fraction of the fig taken out as truma meiser, and it's possible that the fraction is going to be completely hulin. So how does the court do this? In other words, you've taken out, instead of doing this by weight, you've taken out the figs by number, which you're not supposed to do. And you're supposed to weigh it and to be precise. So you've separated out big ones for small ones. Now inside of the small ones, you overdid your tithes. And that's what we were looking at with the grain. So inside you have a piece of hulin. What do? So the Gemara says, and it is written, you shall raise up from it a truma of a shem, a tithe from a tithe, which implies not hulin, but from a tithe. In other words, you're supposed to separate out tithes from a tithe, not from hulin. And so now when you're trying to separate out truma meiser from this meiser rishon portion, you might be separating out a part from the hulin. Again, you end up with a problem. Gemara answers. Rabbi Abba of Kartaganya says, he stipulates and says, the meiser to which these 10 fruits are subject is hereby fixed at the beginning of the stem of the fig. And he specifies and says to the Kohen, until here of the fig, I ended the truma meiser portion. So again, what he's trying to do is he's trying to go back to a measurement. And he's trying to do it where the Levi is going to break off a tenth of the fig and give it to the Kohen as truma meiser. And he's going to break off the tenth nearest the stem, since the fig is definite meiser. And rather, he's really going to be trying to say whatever amount of meiser is needed from all 10 figs should begin at the stem of the fig and extend toward the other end of the fig until the amount of meiser has been reached. And if the Levi chooses to give the entire fig to the Kohen, or the Levi sells the Kohen the entire fig minus the truma meiser portion, he's going to go back and point to the 10th closest to the stem and tell the Kohen that this part is a truma meiser, so that the Kohen will know which part may not be fed to non-Kohanim. In other words, this is going back to say, look, you're really supposed to be doing this by weight, so you're really supposed to be separating off a tenth. And you're really supposed to be doing this by where you're weighing these things out. And you also have to be looking at location. Why? Because that location is implicit in there. And he can't go feed that to a Yisrael. So it has to be eaten by the Kohen. The Gemara now is going to look at this Baraisa that we were just looking at. It's going to say that he says 1/100th of that which is here, which is located on this side of the marked off section, is now Hulin and Tevel. And again, it's always trying to mark off which side is it? And it has to be that way. Gemara is going to ask and say, but let him say 1/100th of what is here, which is located on this side of the marked off section, is here by Meiser. And in other words, why does a person state that 1/100th should remain Tevel from now, and then later on go and declare the 100th Meiser Rishon that could be made into Truma Meiser? And the idea is that once he's speaking about the first 100th, let him just immediately go and sanctify it as Meiser Rishon. And this also comes back to the regard of this Mishnah. And now the Gemara is going to answer these questions. So the Gemara is going to answer is to say that if he did it this way, he'd be found to be advancing the separation of Meiser ahead of the separation out of Truma, which is forbidden. And again, it has to be done in order. So the Gemara asks and says, but let him begin and say 2/100th, which is located on this side, to be marked off, are hereby Truma. Why not just start it off like that? In other words, why start the process as referring to the part that will eventually be Truma Meiser? Let him begin by designating out the 200th part that's going to be marked off at Truma Gedola, and then go off and talk about the other part that's going to be Meiser and Trumas Meiser. Why do you have to go do it where you're not talking about and starting off with Truma Gedola in this formulation? Gemara is going to answer this as well. He's going to say that he would be found to either subtracting from or adding the amount from Truma, or he's going to be adding the amount that he's going to be receiving from the Truma. And this is going to be a flaw in the tithing, because the Truma Meiser has to be exactly 1/10 of the Meiser. But since the first one says an exact 100th, which is located on the north side of the marked off portion, is now Hulin, in other words, Tevel, and afterwards he's going to say the rest of the marked off portion is Truma, it emerges that he neither subtracted or added to his requirement for Truma Gedola, and also he didn't add to the amount. He didn't add to the amount of Truma Gedola, and there's no problem with that, because anyway, Truma Gedola is supposed to be done by estimation. So why is this, right? They're starting off with in this formulation of the Mishnah, they're starting off with the Meiser Rishon first as the marked off portion that gets separated, because it's the way to exactly measure off what is going to be a 10th. And then after that, you take off the Truma Gedola, which is not going to be exact anyway, and it's okay if it's not exact. Okay, anyway, I have to go take care of the baby. Have a great day.